Hello students, this is Dr. Miller and this is assignment number 5. It's really about the trickiest assignment for the whole course. It deals primarily with tools that you have on a camera that help you control the amount of light that gets into your camera and what you do with that light. So these three are called Aperture. Aperture is also sometimes referred to as f-stop, and that is referring to the size of the lens opening. The next element is called shutter speed, and shutter speed is how long the camera opening is actually open and available for the light to come in. And then the third one is called ISO, and that is actually a technical scale for indicating the sensitivity to light that you set your camera. One of the things that makes this tricky though is the cameras that do these three things, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, the best are the single lens reflex cameras. So those of you that have those, unfortunately in this class we have a number of students that are using them, they'll be able to fully do this and use the settings on their camera. And of course the idea is to learn how to manipulate your camera, and these are three of the more critical tools to do it. I encourage all students that have an SLR to know as much as they can about their camera. There are very specific instructions and videos available for your camera. If you just Google using the exact model of your camera, you'll find a bunch of material that's out there for virtually every camera. Now if you have a point and shoot camera, which is one that has a fixed lens, but you can do some manipulations. For example, the ISO may not be listed as ISO, but it might be something like brightness or some other indicator. Shutter speed is difficult control, aperture also, but there are settings on the point and shoot cameras, and I suggest when you do these that you simply try some of the different ones out. For example, if you have a point and shoot camera and you use the setting that might be called night setting, that's going to be one that lets in more light. So you don't have to necessarily shoot at night to use the night setting, but it will let in more light. So this is what you can do. Now if you have a smartphone, cell phone, you can also find that some of the more sophisticated cell phone cameras actually do have elements of manipulation on them, and they're going to relate to some of these, but since they don't actually have the same setup with aperture and shutter speed and ISO, you're going to have to kind of play around with them. So it might be like light sensitivity is the ISO. Just really do the best you can with this. Now whether you have an SLR or not, it's really important to understand the principles of the SLR. And in the materials that we have set up for the course in this assignment number 5 folder, this one right here, Understanding the Depth of Field for Beginners, is an excellent overview of the concept of depth of field. Well, depth of field is, you know, when we did the lens, we were talking about what is in focus and what isn't. Well, that's really what depth of field is. And you can control for depth of field using the aperture control, the f-stop control. So basically the large aperture, which has a small f-stop number, will have less depth of field, and the small aperture, the smaller hole of the lens, which does have the larger number, such as f22 would be a really high f-stop number, you get more stuff in focus. So check out this article because it's really quite important. So you won't be shooting to get really beautiful photographs. You'll be shooting to show your mastery of your camera. So we're going to do some different exercises here. And if you can set your ISO, or again with a point and shoot you might have a night setting, and you can use that for a high ISO. The higher the ISO, the more sensitivity the camera will have to light. Now what happens though is when you have a high ISO, then you get noise. And if this apple shot here was shot with a 200 setting of ISO, then you get this. But if you move it way up to 3200, and ISO settings on really good cameras go into the tens of thousands, you get the ability to take a photograph in more dimly lit environments, but you also are going to introduce more noise. It's sometimes called degradation or pixel degradation for digital cameras. And there's another example over here. So what I want you to do in this exercise is actually set something with a really low ISO, take that, and then move the ISO to really high. And just with these two photographs, we'll see what we can get in a differential sense. Again, photography is a lot about decision making, and you're in a situation and you're going to have to make the decision. What is the best ISO for this situation? Now the aperture aspect of it, and again this is called f-stop, and the large opening f-stop with the small numbers means you only get a part of the image in focus, and when you set that f-stop to a higher number, in the f22 for example is really high, you will get more in focus. However, when you do that, you won't have as much light. This is the trade-off. Let's look at what we're going to do. We're going to keep the subject in focus, but we're going to change the aperture. So on this photograph, the aperture of 2.8 is very low. You would have to change your shutter speed accordingly. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at these three photographs, and where we have an f22 image, he's going to be in focus, but the stuff in the background will be more in focus too. When you're doing your portraits and you want to have that fuzzed out background effect, one of the elements that you will mess around with to try to get that right setting is going to be your aperture or your lens opening or your f-stop. When you have this lower f-stop, then you're going to pretty much get a subject that's in focus and the background out of focus. So that's what you want. We're going to also have you take a couple of photographs, and what I want you to do is to put some objects in a row and then take a photograph shooting down the row. In this example on the left here, you're using crayons. When you have the low f-stop number of 1.4, you can see just this first one, and that's pretty much all that's in focus here. When we change the f-stop to a higher one, f16 in this case, more of the crayons will be in focus. You can also do this putting a ruler out and getting kind of low down on the ruler. 3.2 is pretty open, and you're only getting so much focus up here. And then if you move it to f8, which isn't tremendously different, but it's some, you'll see that there's more in focus. So this area that is in focus is called depth of field. Our shutter, that's how long the opening on your camera will be open to let the light in to hit the sensor. In the old days it was film, but now we have digital cameras with electronic sensors. And so it's how long the camera will be open where the light hits that sensor. So we can do some things with shutter speed. And shutter speed on an SLR camera you can control, and you can have a very slow shutter speed, which means that the opening on the lens with the shutter will be greater. So like a quarter of a second. Now when you're doing these really low shots with a quarter of a second shutter opening, you have to be kind of resting on something, or even better, use a tripod. When the shutter is open for a quarter of a second or a half a second, you will definitely see some movement if you even breathe just a little bit. So you have to be careful with that. And remember, if you're using a long lens like a telephoto lens and you're shooting at a quarter of a second or a half a second, it's even more, because the length of the lens will exacerbate it. And also just the lens means that the camera's heavier. When you're using these slow shutter speeds and a telephoto lens, you really want to have a tripod. What we're going to do is we're going to just don't get dangerous with this or anything, but just get by a road, and you don't have to use the same vehicle, but just kind of in the same place, try to get 3 shots of 3 different vehicles going by. Hopefully they'll be going by at approximately the same speed. But what we will see is the slow shutter speed, like a quarter. The car is going to be blurred because of the motion of the subject. When we go up to a 30th, it's not quite as blurred, but when we go up to 2/50th of a second, you are freezing the action. So freezing the action using a fast shutter speed is a technique, and it's really important. But you can see how you have to think about this, because if you're shooting at a basketball game, chances are the light's going to be kind of dim, so you're going to have to balance, how can I have a fast shutter speed and yet freeze some action specifically? Well, you have to manipulate your shutter speed and your ISO and your lens aperture. So if you want to freeze something at a 50th of a second shutter speed, you're probably going to have to put your ISO up pretty high. And you may want to shoot with a lens opening, an f-stop, that's greater, so a low f-stop. Remember, when you shoot with a low f-stop, your depth of field isn't as great, so you have to be really well focused on your subject. It's tricky stuff. Photography is not easy. Now, I'm going to ask you to do one other thing, and you can capture some motion. Water's a really good thing to shoot if you've got a waterfall nearby. It can actually be done with a hose, a garden hose, or even a faucet if need be. But what you want to do is you want to have 2 shots here, one of which is going to be a slow shutter speed. What happens with this slow shutter speed? You're going to have a blurring effect because the water is moving. This is a fast shutter speed, and that is actually freezing the action of the water. So that's the 2 differences here. This is an effect that's really very popular with nature photography, is to let the water go and get this kind of really filmy, gauzy kind of look, as opposed to this hard, frozen look. But both are effective. It just depends on what you're trying to do. Now there's one other shot I want you to do, and that is where you take the subject matter and you swing your camera along. Again, if you're using a car, instead of just standing there stationary, you're actually going to follow the car by pointing your camera at it. And what you're trying to do in this case is to freeze the subject, but the background may actually be fuzzed out, and that's okay. So we can see differences here by using the panning technique. We're able to keep the subject in focus, but the background is going to be blurred a little bit. And again, it just depends on what you're trying to do. So this is what you're going to do. You're going to take several photographs, and you're going to record what you do. So when you send in your document with the photos on the document, I want you to put in the specific assignment, the camera you are using, and the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO of your camera, if you can do that. If you don't have those settings on your camera, if you have a point and shoot camera and you're using different settings such as night setting or portrait or landscape, you're just going to have to experiment with it a little bit. And if you are using your cell phone and you're manipulating it, tell me what you're doing. You will send in 2 ISO photos, same subject with varied ISOs, and we're going to be looking for grain. Now don't just get them real close. Shoot a big difference with your ISO setting. Again, your point and shoot camera may have a night setting that you can use for your high ISO, and it may have a action setting. Just try it and see what you get. Send me the ones that have the greatest difference in the ISO effect, which would mean one is going to have more grain than the other. Now in the aperture and depth of field, we're going to have a common subject, and we're going to be having an object in that subject, and we're going to go from front to back on that. So there's 2 parts to this. One of them, I'll go back up here, it's this. So one of them, 3 photographs of this common subject, keeping the subject in focus, using your aperture or f-stop. So you're going to have the most wide open, low f-stop, biggest opening, and then you're going to have the smallest opening and one in between. So that's those 3 for this part of it. And then the 2 other photos will be something that goes from front to back. So the crayons, you can set up some drinking glasses, or just use your imagination. Alright, so that's the second element, the aperture element of this exercise. Shutter speed, we're going to do 3 photos. This is the car on the side of the road. And you're going to do so slow, medium, and fast shutter speeds. And then we want to do something that shows movement that you're going to freeze, one fast and one slow. And again, this is like the water here. Okay, so the first one is the car, 1, 2, and 3, and the second part of this is water, 1 and 2, in very different shutter speeds. And then the last one you're going to do is you're just going to take a photo that is using the panning technique. So I want one photo where the main object, the subject, is frozen or blurred and not blurred, and the background is blurred. So it's a total of 13 photographs. Put them into one document, 1 image per page, and make sure to include that information of which assignment, the camera you're using, the shutter, aperture, and ISO settings for each photograph. Now, since this is a really technical exercise, you're actually going to have some extra time. You'll really have 2 weekends to do this. So I'm going to set the due date for this to be the 25th of February. So that's going to give you a little bit more time than you've had to do some of these other assignments. Again, it's a little trickier assignment. Those of you that are just shooting with your cell phone, please look at all of the material that I put in the folder that relates to using the cell phone as a good camera, because there'll be tips and techniques that I want you to apply where they're appropriate to do this exercise. Those of you with an SLR should really look at your manual that came with your camera, or if you're not comfortable with the manual, because sometimes manuals aren't great, go look up some videos on the internet using your camera specific model name, and I think you'll find some good stuff out there. So please let me know if you have any questions or any issues, if I can help you in any way.